everyone, and welcome to my talk titled Finding Success and how we switched from finding hits to finding hit makers. And we, who are we? We're JoyPac. We're a publisher for hyper-casual games with offices in Asia and Europe. Originally, we started out bringing Western games to Asia, and we're still doing that. But these days, we're also publishing games worldwide. My name is Falko. I've been in the games industry for about 14 years at this point, and I'm a senior publishing manager at JoyPac. So that means I'm generally the first point of contact for developers that get in touch with us, or one of the first point of contacts. And then I'm with the developers all the way through, staying the point of contact throughout prototyping, production, and so on. And let me jump right into the topic. I'm going to give you a little bit of background first, and don't worry, this is not going to be any of these advertising talks. I just want to give you a little bit more background so you understand why we chose one system in the beginning and why we eventually switched to the other and how we're doing things these days. So we started bringing Western games to the Asian market with the focus of having an experienced team in China when it came to publishing, UA, and so on, and then mostly a brand business development part in the West to look for titles that performed very well in the West and bring those to Asia. In the West, we work with everybody from small development studios that self-published in the West, all the way up to mid-sized to bigger publishers that had the Western market very well under their control, but maybe hesitated a little bit going to Asia, specifically China, with all the legal requirements and other challenges to that market. And we're looking for a partner that can help them there with these kind of elements. But then in 2020, about a year and a half after we were founded, a year and a half to 2 years, we wanted to expand ourselves into a wider market. And of course, after looking into growing opportunities in Asia, we looked in other interesting territories for growth. And of course, the Western market, specifically the US and Western Europe, are the biggest markets for hyper casual. So that was a logical place for us to go. During that switch, we pretty much realized immediately, or very quickly at least, that the single game approach we did in Asia didn't really work out for us that well for this new kind of model. So we switched from looking for single games that already performed well in the Western market to more long-term partnerships that has their unique advantages that helped us overcome a few problems of the single game model. And I'm going to explain a little bit what exactly those problems are and what the advantages of this new, what we call portfolio model, or what you heard us refer to as hyperfuel as well, and why we changed and how this is working out for us now. And and all the way, how did that bring us to successful games in both the East and West? So these days we had #1 hits in both the US and the Chinese App Store and a few other app stores as well when it comes to downloads. ABC Runner being the first one that coming out of this new kind of partnership that then eventually hit the top of the charts in the US in January 2021. Talking about the single game model, so this worked perfectly fine for us for the Chinese markets, right? We could look at games that were already established that had a huge amount of users in the West. So we really had a bunch of data on those games, and they were pre-vetted by that market. Yes, there are some differences when it comes to Asia. There are some games that didn't really translate it that easily or that well. But in hyper casual, we often deal with concepts that are very easily understood by a large amount of users across the world, that are based on everyday tasks that are very similar for people around the world. So it's perfect to take games like that from the West to Asia and have very similar successes there with hyper casual games. But it had a few issues. And there was a huge amount of competition in the West, of course, because having this portfolio of games to choose from was mostly from other publishers that already evaluated games along this process. The process was mostly developers finishing up their games and then going to bigger publishers to test them. And us being a new player in the West, once we did the switch, we're of course not as attractive as some of the established really big companies in the West. So we had to differentiate ourselves, but more often than not, most of the games we saw already have been looked at by the top 1 to maybe 3 publishers. So of course they take off the cream of the crop and focus on these games when they test really well early on. And for us, there were only games left that didn't reach their benchmarks, which was fine for finding some successes, because the benchmarks of those companies receiving that many games to look at were of course very, very high. But it also means that it's very hard to find a top 10 potential hit, because that one is more likely than not already picked up by one of the other publishers. So there were also studios that already were working with these publishers, and of course they had even less of an incentive to switch publishers, right? Like people that already had a hit with one of the top 3 publishers would not necessarily take their game and then show them to all the other publishers later on, but they know the reach one of the top partners can get them, and they'd rather, because hyper-casual games are fast to make, drop a game when it doesn't work with that partner and make another game specifically for the needs and based on the feedback maybe of that partner, making it even harder for us to get access to studios, even introduction or introductory tests with studios that are already kind of part of the ecosystem and have their very well established kind of partnerships in the market. So for us, that meant we got very limited amount of new products to look at, and especially products that had a very high chance of succeeding in the market. We try to differentiate ourselves, of course, with some of our USPs, being strong in Asia and China being a huge and interesting market, something that helped us a bit, but it was not as interesting to developers as we thought or hoped it might be, because of course you focus on markets that are closer to you if you're a developer, which is more likely the Western market, the North American market. And why you think of China as like, yeah, I heard that this is a big place. I know that the Korean and Japanese markets are huge, but it's not really on the top of your mind. Generally, as a developer, you're happy having a success in the West, and you're not really seeing that, hey, there's as much reach again in Asia if you find somebody who can provide to both of these markets. And then, of course, working on single games, once we found interesting developers to work with, usually there was a ton of overhead when it came to communication, the legal part, technical parts such as SDK integrations, because we tested a single game, maybe sometimes 2 with a single developer. So everything had to be re-established, and we worked on simplifying that as much as possible, not requiring any kind of paperwork to start a quick test, to use a lot of standard tools and communication. But in the end, every developer is a little bit different, every publisher is a little bit different. So there was always a getting to know each other phase, which of course took resources out of the system that we could have used on and are now using on other stuff, improving the success of future prototype, if not that current game. So we switched to what we call the portfolio model. And while for a publisher, this also comes with a couple of challenges, a major one being financial challenges, because in most of these scenarios, a publisher will be involved in funding, at least partially, if not complete, the prototyping process on the developer's side. For us, it came with a huge range of advantages. And these days, how we do it is we have a hand-picked list of studios. Right now it's about 5, but we're open in scaling that up a little bit more, where we work with very closely with each of these studios with a lot of daily back and forth, working on multiple prototypes in succession rather than just a single game. So this way we can help these studios build expertise over time from prototype to prototype, because there's a lot of communication going back and forth during and between every single prototype, every single test, every single result. So we're can feedback everything that we tested, how the game performed, how people reacted to the UA marketing part of things, but also just general trends that are going on. What else is happening in our portfolio? Having multiple studios to work with, we can share limited amount of information regarding results from from the other games that we're testing, things that we know are not working right now, or trends that we're seeing coming up with the studios, so that enables them to improve the success chance from prototype to prototype, and we don't have to rely on the whatever each side comes into the relationship with. And of course, for the studios, this is also a huge opportunity to learn more from a company that has a bunch more games coming through. If you're only relying on your own development process, then of course you have way less examples to compare a current prototype to versus a publisher that has a bunch of new prototypes every week that they're looking at. We're trying to stick to a very quick prototyping schedule. So generally, we test for about 1 week after about 2 to 3 weeks to development on the studio side. So we're trying to get to data very early. That also means that rather than having to finish almost a whole game to convince a publisher that you're having something that is worth looking at, we can from the beginning try to collect data as fast as possible whenever it makes sense, and not waste a lot of work on a prototype if we can early on identify that it's probably not going to work in the market. And then this model also allows us to quickly pivot when we have a positive test result. So if we have a game that tests very quickly, since we already have a partnership set up with the studio that is that is planned to transfer quickly from prototyping into full production, we don't have to step back, do any other contracts. We can immediately shift from the prototyping, maybe even get some more resources onto a game to then keep working on that prototype and making it into a full game. Because for us, the speed of that is really important, and I have a little bit more about that later on. But you heard me talk about testing. Why is it so important? It is important because in hyper casual, it really depends on how the market reacts to your game, often at an early stage. The core of the game, the setting, the theme, the core gameplay, maybe a big aha moment that makes your game interesting and stand out. Those things need to be just right. And more often than not, you can find this out by testing them very early on. So as I said, our prototypes with the studios we work with usually take 2 to 3 weeks to develop. They're usually 1, 2, or 3 developers on set prototype for that amount of time. So even small studios can usually finish multiple prototypes a month that we can look at. Once we come to testing, which means we're creating an app store page for the game together with the developer, not always in our account, usually in like a test account or the developer's account, we then create a set of creatives, not being too experimental at that early stage, representing the game mostly, and then test those ads in multiple networks. So specifically for us, of course, having China as one of our major markets, we're testing games in both the Asian and the Western markets. And we don't really believe in kind of like lookalike markets or anything like that for hyper casual. I know that's very important for mid-core games, to not burn potential whales, for example, too early on. But with the mass amount of users that we're talking for with hyper casual, we're going straight for the US or China. Spending a couple $100 for a couple days, which means a few hundred users per day, doesn't really affect the long-term potential of a game. So it's perfectly fine to test in these markets, and it actually gives you more reliable information because it's the market that you're actually going to go out in later on. Doesn't tell you 100% of it will scale the same way once you're going for a higher mass of users, but it gives you a lot of good indications. So we're testing in multiple networks and multiple territories. Also multiple networks because they have different kinds of audiences. For example, we're using Facebook, which of course as a social media has a very good reach when it comes to hyper casual games, but there's also a bit of a wild times right now with iOS 14.5 and other factors kind of like changing the data there. But we want this kind of audience. We're also looking at other social networks that could be interesting to test in. But on the other hand, we're testing a lot with Mintegral, which for us is perfect because it's equally strong in the US and in Asia. And gives us a lot of good information there. They have a good, sizable hyper-casual audience, but they're also reaching the more gamer types. So sometimes it works for different kinds of games. We definitely had games that worked well on Mintegral that didn't work well on Facebook, and in the end turned out to be very successful for us. And of course, it gives you an idea of how similar networks would work, like, right, for Mintegral, how more of the typical ad networks, video networks would perform. And on Facebook, while it's a bit specific, but it gives you an idea of other social media channels. So testing this early on gives you a lot of more information than if you just test one network, especially if you have overlap and works well in both. That really means that, hey, you could have a potential hit at your hands here, and you should focus on that game. And if you have that, if you find that game that is potentially a hit, then quick iterations are key. You start right away into further development. Generally, if we're not completely sure, we're setting up like an in-between version. Even for full productions, we're setting up multiple in-between versions so we can keep testing the games while they're in development, because things change really quickly in hyper-casual, and maybe improvements to the retention, for example, don't work out as much as you hope to. So maybe you have to abandon a game halfway through, or maybe it picks up even more and then you want to maybe put more resources in it, increase the marketing early on, and have it even quicker to market to avoid competition or copycats. And this shifting has to be really fast. We generally say if you launch a game more than 3 months after you had good results, or generally 3 months of overall development time, you often have lost your chance. So within 2 months, test results kind of expire and are not really that valid anymore. So you really have to be quick when it comes to finishing up games that show potential. And of course, throughout all this testing, we're looking at different KPIs on the UA side, which is extremely important to hyper-casual, because even with more advanced hyper-casual game, there is a limit on how long people are going to stay. And the viral factor, yes, once you're in the charts kicks in, but it's hard to rely on that. Lower, so you really are going for low CPIs, low cost per installs, for a good click-through rate. And we're looking as well at what we call IVR, sometimes result rate, the impression to install ratio. Because it kind of like different networks sometimes test a bit differently, depending on how the ads are set up technically sometimes. So it is important to compare kind of like the overall pictures. How many people have seen the ad and how many actually started playing the game. Once they start playing the game, of course, you want to track how's the retention going. Of course, you have very limited content at this point. We're generally testing prototypes that have 10 levels max. We tried testing even smaller prototypes, and eventually you run into problems where app stores will not let your game into the app store because of the low amount of content. So Apple and Google partially are actually looking out for that kind of stuff. So you have to have a certain amount of content, but more importantly, quality to get into that. So day one retention, we can get very reliably. Everything beyond that is a bit iffy with these early prototypes because content repeats quite quickly, usually at that rate. But stuff like playtime, we can look at how much time are people actually spending in the game, and some other auxiliary stuff like the completion rate. So if you know that, hey, I have a puzzle game and it's very apparent if I have only 5 stages to the player that this is the first puzzle they're solving again, they will immediately recognize that. You want to look at stuff like completion rate rather than the retention, because certain game types don't really lend themselves to playing them over and over again. In idle games, you might see high retention right away, even with very little content. In puzzle games, you really have to look at, are people finishing all the content that I have? And then with new prototypes going further, you can see if that number goes up, or if the retention goes up with more content being added because people are still playing through everything you have. So with all this testing going on, what makes a hit maker? What makes a studio that can reliably produce games that have high hit potential in the market? Because it is not necessarily about the technical skills of a studio. So of course, this will be from a publisher's perspective, right? This is what we are looking for. But even if you're a development studio, I hope this will help you understand or get a feeling for what publishers are looking for, so you can present your skill set in the right light. So you seem as an attractive business partner for a publisher, so you find the partner that you actually want to work with. As I said, it's not necessarily about technical skills, not how good your in-house produced art assets are, not how good your programmers are. That can help, but I think in hyper-casual, most importantly, it is how you understand hyper-casual as a genre, the style of games, the kind of settings that are successful, the themes, how to reach that audience in the most efficient way, and not so much the execution of it. So at least that is not the most important part. If you have a feeling for what are upcoming trends, what do hyper-casual players want to play, you'll have much easier times finding reliable success in the market. There are some exceptions for that. As I said, like all of this can help, and especially tech art people or programmers that can help visualize unique concepts, from peeling fruit to physics-based simulations. All this can help a hyper-casual game stand out compared to other games in the market. So this is maybe one of the cases where technical ability can actually directly improve the success rate of the game. But it can also go the other way. You shouldn't focus on overly complex 3D models, for example, because at a certain point, they become more niche, less appealing to a wide market. So you have to be really careful how far you take that. You also have to be able to keep up with the speed of hyper-casual. As I said, we're testing multiple prototypes per development studio per month. And this means there's a constant need to churn out new ideas, because not all of the ideas are going to make it to prototype. So this can be very tiring. It's also very rewarding to have a lot of different concepts see the light of day and a lot of your ideas turning into games. But on the other hand, it can be tiring if you're not used to that or not prepared for that, to constantly have new ideas and execute on new projects on a very, very quick, regular basis. So you should be, you as a person and as your team should be ready for this kind of environment. And then connected to that, having a single good idea is not necessarily enough to be a successful hyper-casual studio. So it can be a hit. Like, there is a possibility of your first hyper-casual game being a hit, even though the likelihood goes up the more you work in the market, just like with most other genres. But even more than in other genres, you need to be able to recreate games that reach the top of the charts again and again and again. The lifetime of a hyper-casual user is much lower. You don't really have whales that will support you over multiple years. So you have to be really in the mindset of churning out new ideas on a regular basis, of like not letting this creativity go, of constantly iterating and looking at the market, constantly getting inspiration from everyday life, wherever you get it, to be able to keep up with the production of new and new titles going forward. And then last but not least, hyper-casual is not really an environment for large egos. So if you're a perfectionist that really wants to tinker with a design until it gets really right, do a dozen tests, go back to the drawing board, reiterate on a game too long, that really doesn't work that well with hyper-casual. You have to be open to quickly abandon ideas, and for the ideas that you take forward, take feedback, take data into account to change your original vision to be able to reach a game that is appealing to the most amount of players. So as a publisher, how do we find these hit makers, and how, if you're a studio, can you get into a position where you get found by those publishers? So first of all, we try to test with a lot of different profiles of studios. So small studios, big studios, studios that have more wild out there ideas, people that are more inspired by classic game designs and established core gameplay mechanics, to kind of have a wide range of data coming in and seeing what works for us, but also kind of like, just a wealth of ideas that are not necessarily always overlapping with each other too much. We're looking for studios that fit our individual strengths and weaknesses. And that will be the same when you're looking for a publisher. If the publisher is good for you as a specific studio, not every hyper casual publisher will have the same success with all games. Some publishers are more focused on, as I said, more arcade style gameplay mechanics that are more established. Some go more with a social media, kind of very shareable, TikTokish nature of meme games and these kind of things. And the UA marketing process of a publisher has to fit to the ideas that you as a developer have, because those go hand in hand. If the publisher cannot reach the kind of audience that would be interested in your games, then maybe there's a better fit for you out there. The studio doesn't have to be big. As I said, we had great experience with studios of 3 people. Actually, ABC Runner by Umami Games, those guys were 3 people at the time. We had that hit with them and tested multiple prototypes. Now they're able to scale to multiple teams and more prototypes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a small team cannot compete with a studio of 30, 40, 50 people that have a bunch of different projects running, because there's also a limit of how many people you should put on a prototype. And then testing several prototypes is necessary to understand a studio. So we try to get an impression of a studio when we talk to them and trying to see if they're a good partner, if they have the right mindset, and if they have concepts that fit us well. But you will never find out with the first game you test. So we always set up these partnerships for a couple of months, so we can test at least 5-6 prototypes to, first of all, get over the hurdle that I mentioned earlier, the establishing communication and technical setups and stuff like that, to then have a couple of prototypes that are not affected by that anymore, and also see the trajectory of how well can we support the studio with feedback, how well is that feedback accepted, how much improvement is there from prototype to prototype. We don't expect the first game to be a hit, but of course you have to have the feeling that you're building on something or towards something, and that is very important to figure out over a longer period of time and not just a quick one-off test. And then make sure you have sufficient time for your partners. I mean, very important to us that there is a lot of communication, and while it might seem interesting just to get a bunch of studios on board and let them do their things, of course there's the financial risk of like having to support the many studios, but also from a publisher perspective, it's kind of like we cannot teach that many studios, cannot update that many studios, cannot keep that many studios in the loop of what we're seeing over all the tests to help them improve the titles and eventually the success rate. So for us, it's very important to have the time to have this individual relationship with all the studios that we work with, to improve together throughout this process. And that only works if you have the time to communicate, which is one of the reasons, as I mentioned, why we switched to this longer portfolio model from the single game model. And then maybe last but not least, really quick, if you're a developer, from your perspective, what should you be looking for in a publisher? First of all, of course, previous successes and the maximum reach. Has the publisher had hits before? Did he have hits in multiple markets? Did he have multiple hits or just one? Is it something that is purely the US, or is it the US and China? And then how big are those hits? Because sometimes it's more important to have a publisher that can really get you worldwide into a lot of stores up in the charts, rather than just having the US iOS store. Expertise and data from portfolio. How many games is the publisher working on simultaneously, but also in the past? Simultaneously important because the market is changing, that you have data that is current for multiple games. So a publisher can always tell you, hey, we tested 4 games last week and 3 the week before. We know what is trendy right now and what are good numbers. Maybe Facebook CPIs went up, and a test that might look bad to you if you compare it to a 3-month-old test is not that bad in the current environment. Communication. Does the publisher give you this information? How do they communicate it? How easy is it to get your publisher to answer your questions? And how is that flow? Connected to that, the data transparency. What is the publisher actually able to tell you? Do you have access to some of the tools? There will always be some limits because publishers cannot freely share the data of other development studios, or at least won't. So there should be some transparency around your own games, but also kind of at least summaries and updates about what's going on overall in the market and in the portfolio of the publisher. And of course, last but not least, financial support. Does the publisher take on some of the financial risk of making these prototypes, maybe all of the risk? And does that help you to support your studio a little bit longer, to test multiple prototypes and get to the hit eventually, and having multiple shots and more time to improve and learn about the market, and keep up to date with the market, compared to publishers that don't support you, where you have to go into a little bit of the financial risk, but might get better deal terms. So all of these things are always a bit of a give and take, and you should consider what is best for your studio. And yeah, that is it. Thank you very much. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'm just falko@joypacgames.com. So reach out to me there, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and hope to talk to you during the show. See you guys.